If I asked you to pinpoint the beginning of the Christian story, what would you say? There are, of course, several possible answers. Perhaps it began with the Great Commission, when Jesus sent his disciples into the world, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Perhaps it was at the empty tomb, when the disciples had the first inkling that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Or perhaps it was when Jesus began his ministry in Galilee. Or maybe it started with his baptism by John, or his birth in Bethlehem, or the announcements of the angels to Mary and to Joseph. All of these are reasonable answers, and all of them have merit. But I date the beginning of the Christian story even earlier than all of these things. Way earlier. Like way over 1,000 years earlier. Even before there was a people called Israel. I think of the beginning of the Christian story as the call of God to an obscure man in a dusty village in what is now Turkey named Abram, whose name was ultimately changed to Abraham. Now, before you roll your eyes, hear me out. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Monday, February 27th, 2023. As important a figure as Abraham is, we just don't know a lot about him. He lived so long ago that all we have is a series of stories handed down through the generations until they were finally written down in their present form. But for today's reading, it's not what Abraham says or does that's important. In fact, Abraham doesn't speak at all. He simply responds. God is the one who speaks here, and what God says to Abraham has everything to do with who we are as Christian people, even though this took place many, many centuries before the birth of Jesus. In this passage, God gives Abram a command and a promise. I'm particularly interested in the promise. Here is how Genesis records it. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Traditionally, commentators have focused on the promise of land and descendants to Abraham. But that misses the more important element, I think, and that is the promise of blessing. It's a twofold blessing. The first element is that God promises to bless Abram. That blessing does consist of descendants and land, and the promise that Abram's descendants will be a great nation. That promise is repeated throughout Genesis, and in the next few chapters of the book, we'll wait in suspense for the promise of descendants to materialize. But the second part of the promise, and in my mind the more significant one, is that Abraham will not only be blessed, but he will be a blessing. More than that, he and his descendants will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That is absolutely breathtaking, both in its intention and in its scope. One of the fundamental mistakes God's people, both Israel and the Christian church, have made is thinking that the blessing is for us. But God makes crystal clear here, for anyone who bothers to pay attention, that the whole human family is included here. Abram and Abram's descendants, including the church, are given a blessing in order that they may in turn be a blessing to others. Sort of takes your breath away, doesn't it? That's why I said at the very first that the Christian story, I think, begins with this story. For it is here that we learn what our vocation, our calling is as God's people. No room for self-congratulations, no room for hoarding the blessing, no room for dismissing others as less worthy of the blessing. For God chose a nobody in an out-of-the-way place to bear God's blessing to the world. He didn't choose Abram because of any merit on his part, any more than God chooses us because of any merit on our part. How then can we even imagine that the blessing of God is for us alone? So what does Abram do in response? He gets up, leaves home, and he follows where God will lead him, sight unseen. God's blessing should prompt us to move in the direction God is heading. Otherwise, our blessing means nothing. Tomorrow, what then does it even mean to be a blessing? But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.